Hello, 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 and welcome back to DLA Alternative. It's your boy Brandon, and I hope everyone is doing phenomenal as always. And cheers to over 1,000 subs once again. We literally are already almost at 1.1, so you guys are killing it on these and killing it on all the views on the most recent videos, which amazes me, okay? But yes, I promised you that we are going to finally get into a big topic and a big scene and episode in this series, being the sauna test theory. So let's get right into it, people. So basically with this one, I want to talk about some scenes that lead up to the sauna test, and then we'll get into the sauna test, okay? Because there's some interesting things. And in my post, if you saw my post about that, there's some weird things going on with Will that I noticed, okay? But basically, right after Max and Elle go investigate, and they start noticing that Billy has something wrong with him or something is going weird, okay? Right at the end of that episode as well, we see Will go kind of crazy, okay? That's when him and Mike get in that argument, and then we see Will at Castle Byers, and he feels the mind flayer activate, okay? So keep that in mind. And that's also the scene when we see him looking at like old memories, and then all of a sudden he just destroys Castle Byers. So keep that in mind as well. But basically we're going to start off the next morning when the boys call Max and Elle and have them come over, and they start talking about this, and Will starts explaining how he's been feeling the mind flayer, okay? This is where it gets very interesting, and I didn't really notice this before. But basically, if you saw the memory theories, we've been talking a lot about how certain people and certain characters do not remember their involvement in the first Shadow origin story, okay, involving Henry Creel specifically, which we now know in season 4 of this show. So a big thing for me I've been trying to figure out is if we see any major connections to Vecna or Henry throughout this show before we ever saw him or knew who he was in season 4. But in this scene it gets very interesting, people, so just keep that in mind. But Will starts off and he starts explaining what he's been feeling, okay, and he says that he just didn't really want to believe it. He didn't think it was actually happening, okay? So keep that in mind, that in the memory theories, we talked a lot about this. We just talked in the memory theory part 2 about how Brenner tells Elle why she can't remember is because she just doesn't want to, okay? That our brains have a defense mechanism that protects us from bad memories, okay? So logically, this is kind of an explanation of that in a way, is that Will kind of says he just didn't want to believe it. He tried to push it out of his mind that it was actually happening, okay? But then he explains the times that he actually was feeling it, and he says the Day of the Dead was the first time, and then he says at the farm, the Nelson farm, when they're running up that hill, okay? And then he mentions the scene we just talked about at Castle Byers when he felt it again right after he destroyed Castle Byers, okay? But real quickly, the thing I found interesting, okay, here is that we see Will destroy Castle Byers in the real world in season 3, okay, right now, right before all this shit happens, okay? But what's interesting is now this means that Castle Byers is now destroyed in the real world and the Upside Down. And it was already destroyed in the Upside Down all the way back in season 1, okay, which is very interesting. And I don't know if there's a connection there, but there is. Because when we see at the end of the bathtub episode, okay, when Will hears something outside, we know he's in the Upside Down, he's in Castle Byers, and then bam, something bashes in and destroys it. And we get proof of that when Hopper and Joyce go to the Upside Down, okay? So like I said, I don't know if there's a connection here, but that I found that very interesting, that now all of a sudden Castle Byers is now destroyed in both the Upside Down and the real world. So now there's kind of a connection of what's going on in the Upside Down to the future of what happens in Stranger Things in the real life Hawkins, okay? So just keep that in mind. I don't know if there's a connection, but let me know your thoughts. But then this is when Will actually starts explaining how it feels, okay? Actually physically feels. And he says it's kind of like a drop on a roller coaster. And he asks them, that's that funny scene where he asks them, oh, do you guys know what that feels like? And Max and Mike are like, yeah. And then 11 just pops in and she goes, no. But basically, Will explains it like everything inside of your body just sinking all at once, but worse. And I found this very interesting, okay, because we have this connection to the Day of the Dead like he just mentioned, okay? But what we see this mind flayer monster, this physical actual monster, okay, that is in this season, what we see this monster do is actually this, okay? It's not just a sinking feeling. It's worse than that sinking feeling because basically this monster is just sucking everything out of them. That's what this thing is doing to them. So I hate to say this, but you gotta think about this logically, people, that when Billy first gets infected, okay, at the very end of chapter 1 of this season, okay, at the very start of this season, Basically, Billy is a goner at that point in time already, okay, because of what this physical monster is doing. We actually find out in the next episode, the Flayed, okay, when Will is explaining that this is not the same thing, that this is different, because they find out that they're drinking chemicals, okay? And unfortunately, the proof is there that Billy was already a goner, because we see that when Billy is at the pool drinking the bleach or whatever, drinking the chemicals when Karen walks in, okay? He's standing there drinking chemicals. So obviously, they already proved this in the show, that whoever is drinking chemicals and the Flayed are goners already. And the difference, in my opinion, why Will ends up saying this is something different, okay? The difference is that this is affecting the entire body, people. This is not just affecting the mind like the Mind Flayer does. So keep that in mind, that this is different this time, and it's excelling. It's now taking over the entire body. Because what we saw in season 2 when it infected Will, it obviously did not work correctly, just infecting the mind, because that's what happened to Will. But basically, Will keeps going and he explains that you feel completely cold and you cannot breathe, which basically, in my opinion, sounds like death, okay? Like you feel just dead inside, which fully connects to this season. So let me know your thoughts if you think the same. But in my opinion, that fully connects to how this season is. This line right here, what he says, it just feels cold and you cannot breathe and everything inside of you just sinks out of you. But the thing about that is that Will knows all of this, okay? But there is something else going on with Will here, all right? And we're going to keep going. So let's just keep going with this, because basically Will says that, all right? And then all of a sudden, Elle looks at him like she knows this feeling. And I thought it was kind of interesting that they show this little quick shot of 11 looking at Will like she knows what this feels like. So let me know your thought about that as well. But this next part is what caught my eye, with how Will starts explaining this, okay, even more, all right? Because he explains, people, and trust me, I really did not think anything of this, okay? But all of a sudden, if you really listen to what Will says here, he says, I always felt it when he was close, okay? This is when he starts explaining the Mind Flayer as a he. And in my opinion, they know this as just the Mind Flayer, okay? They don't know if it's a he or a she or anything, okay? So it's weird that all of a sudden Will starts explaining the Mind Flayer as a him. And this continues with how he explains this, okay? We'll keep going. Because right after he says this, okay, I always felt it when he was close, okay? It shows a clip of when Will first sees the Mind Flayer, okay? And this is before he was infiltrated, which is very interesting. This is actually the very first time when he's in his house and he's in the bathroom up late at night. And then all of a sudden he hears the storm outside of his house. He walks out that front door, that famous scene of him walking out the front door, okay? And then all of a sudden he sees the storm and sees the Mind Flayer in the distance, people. But keep in mind, this is before he was infiltrated by the Mind Flayer, before he had a connection to the Mind Flayer. So keep that in mind, because right after that, people, oddly enough, we get the connection to Max and Will in this scene, because Max ends up asking Will the question when who was close. And then Will obviously says the Mind Flayer, okay? But then this is when it snaps into the scene when we see Will all of a sudden getting infiltrated by the Mind Flayer, all right? So the two little scenes that they all of a sudden give us little hints to in this, if we pay close attention, is those two scenes that Will was feeling the Mind Flayer supposedly before he actually was ever infiltrated by the Mind Flayer, which does not make any sense, correct? So with that being said, I'm not going to say any more shit before I just reveal what I think, but let's keep going, people. But right after that, this is when 11 says, she goes, well, I closed the gate. And this is when Will basically says, well, what if we lock the part that was in him out of there? What if we locked him out? And what you got to keep in mind here is that I thought about something about this, okay, that Will is basically saying, like, well, what if we locked him out, okay? But if you remember in season 2, okay, when all of a sudden Hopper starts noticing that Will is tapping and doing like the Morse code or whatever, and oddly enough, the message that they think Will is telling them to do, okay, keep that in mind, that they think Will is the one telling them to close the gate. That's what the message ends up saying. If I'm correct about this, I am truly thinking that Will is connecting to something else that is also connected to the Mind Flayer, all right? Not just the Mind Flayer itself. And during that scene, he's obviously infiltrated by the Mind Flayer, but that's the thing, is if Will was connecting to something before the Mind Flayer, all right, what was he connecting to? And that's when we see Will get his little neck thing that he gets, okay, that he's connecting to the Mind Flayer, right? But this next scene, people, in my opinion, is the straight up proof that Will is connecting to someone else, being a he specifically, and not the Mind Flayer before he was ever infiltrated, okay? And yes, that was a lot, and I'm sure that's confusing, but just keep this in mind, that this next part, when Will starts explaining even more, all of a sudden, Will starts drawing a picture, people. And like I said, this, in my opinion, people, is proof that Will is connecting to someone else, being, in my opinion, Henry Creel. And not Vecna, but Henry Creel, okay? And the reason being is because look at how Will starts drawing this image, okay? He doesn't use crayons or colored pencils like we normally see him using, okay? But all of a sudden, Will just randomly starts using black charcoal to draw this Mind Flayer and to show that he had a piece of it connected to him, right? But if you have paid close attention in this show and you watch this show all the way through and you love season 4, okay, what do we see at the very end of season 4? Very, very close to the end of season 4. We see this scene actually twice, which is very interesting. And the first time it's actually different because it's done in colored pencil. And that is when Vecna is showing Nancy his past, okay? When Vecna is showing Nancy his past and his childhood and the reason of all of this, okay, we see Henry in the attic and he's drawing a picture of a spider, okay, and he's drawing it in colored pencil, and that's what Nancy sees, okay? But at the very end of season 4, when Vecna is showing 11 this and the reason of why she did this to him and why all of this basically happened, what we see is this same scene, except that we see Henry Creel drawing the Mind Flayer this time with black charcoal, people. So in my opinion, people, I'm going to be dubbing this proof that Will is connecting to Henry Creel, not Vecna, but Henry Creel, okay? Which, like I said, you might be confused about this, but the major point here is that I think he is connecting to Henry Creel because I don't think he's connecting to the Mind Flayer just necessarily. He's connecting to someone who is also connected to the Mind Flayer, being Vecna, which is also Henry Creel infected by the Mind Flayer, people. So keep this all in mind, that Henry Creel is also Vecna, but only because he is infiltrated by the Mind Flayer. So going into season 5, you need to keep in mind that we see these behind the scenes footage of Henry Creel with Holly Wheeler. We do not see him as Vecna with Holly Wheeler. So remember that. And at the very end of season 4, people, what do we see? We see him get torched to a crisp, okay? And what happens to the Mind Flayer from heat or fire specifically, people? We see the Mind Flayer come out of somebody. So with that being said, I truly think that in season 5, we are going to see Henry Creel again, and not just as Vecna, because I truly think that that Mind Flayer exited Vecna when that all happened at the end of season 4. And that, in my opinion, would also give us an explanation that why all of a sudden Will, being in Hawkins, feels the Mind Flayer all of a sudden, right? But with all that being said, let's just keep going, all right? And let me know your thoughts about all this. This is just my opinion, but it's a little odd that we see that drawing from Henry Creel 2 different ways when he's saying this story to 2 different people, okay? But then at the very end of season 4, we see that black charcoal drawing that Henry Creel is drawing of the Mind Flayer, and this connects straight to how Will draws this in this scene, which is very interesting to me. And if you're doubting this, we have seen Will draw this Mind Flayer separately, okay? And he did not use black charcoal or think to use black charcoal before. And yes, there's obviously the explanation that that could have been the only thing that he had to draw with, all right? But think about it, people. Because basically he explains the process of what happened at the end of season 2, okay? That a part of it was attached to him, okay? And then his mom got it out of him. So keep that in mind, that if there is a connection to Henry Creel's story and Will's story with what happened in season 2, and this is kind of what we're seeing here, it's a little odd that we see him say, and my mom got it out of me. Because if you think about it, people, Joyce has major involvement in the first Shadow story. So I thought that was super interesting. So let me know your thoughts. But then Will starts explaining a little more, and he says something a little bit interesting. And I don't know if I'm really hearing it correctly, but I thought it was interesting, okay, because he says it a certain way. Because basically he explains that Elle closed the gate right after his mom got it out of him, okay? But then he says this interesting thing, and he goes, but what if the part that was still in me is still in our world, in Hawkins, okay? So I thought it was a little odd, and like I said, I don't know if I'm hearing it correctly, but I thought it was a little odd that he says the part that was still in me, but he just explained that Joyce got it out of him. So I'm a little confused about why these two things are being said at certain times, but it doesn't connect properly if you think about it. He basically says that it got out of him, Elle closed the gate, but then he says the part that was still in him. So I'm a little confused, so let me know your thoughts. I might have caught something, but I'm not too sure if I'm hearing it correctly, but let me know your thoughts. But then this is when we see another connection to Max and Will being involved with this whole explanation and scenario, okay? Which is a little odd that we see what happens to Max at the very end of season 4, and now she has major involvement with kind of banishing, you know? But my point is that Max says, well, the demodogs died, so that means when the brain dies, the body dies, okay? Well, in my opinion, people, this is why in season 3, we see that this is something different, okay? Because the Mind Flayer, whoever is controlling the Mind Flayer, all right? That person or the Mind Flayer itself should logically know, okay, that just affecting the mind does not work, that they can beat this by if it was just affecting the mind of somebody. So no doubt in my mind, that's why we see in season 3 that it affects more than just the mind. It's affecting the entire freaking body, people. It literally is sucking everything out of them, growing bigger and bigger, and then putting part of the Mind Flayer in them to still control the body like a virus, right? But then our boy Mike the Heart pops in, and he basically says, he goes, we can't just assume that. We need to assume the worst, that the Mind Flayer is back, okay? And then our boy Will jumps in again, and this is when he starts talking about the Mind Flayer as a him again, okay? Quite a lot during this line, all right? He basically says that if he is back, he'd want to attach himself to somebody else. So our boy Will keeps addressing the Mind Flayer as a him, okay? Which is very odd because they know this monster is just a big dust cloud, okay? It's not a he, she, or anything, all right? So logically, Will, for some reason, knows that the Mind Flayer is a him, which is very odd. And you gotta pay attention to this, but it's very odd. So let me know your thoughts. Because then Will jumps in and he goes, a new me. And then Lucas all of a sudden jumps in and he goes, a new host. And then Max asks and she goes, well, how do you know if somebody is a host? And this doesn't connect to this scene right here, but it pops to another scene, which I found very interesting why they popped this scene in right after that question, okay? All of a sudden, it pops to the scene where Joyce and Hopper show up at the mayor's office, and they're driving over a sign that says, Klein's a swine, okay? Which, in my opinion, connects to somebody who has major involvement with this town and how this town runs and operates, okay? Which I thought was very interesting. But the other interesting thing is that this question that was just asked is, how do you know if someone is a host, okay? Well, if we're connecting this origin story here, okay, and we have a connection that involves Hopper, Joyce, and Henry Creel, and now all of a sudden, in my opinion, we're seeing signs of Henry Creel connecting to Will, okay? But do you not find it interesting that all of a sudden it says this, all right, and then we see that it shows us Hopper and Joyce out of nowhere. It asks, how do we know if someone's a host? And then boom, Hopper and Joyce, all right? So I don't know where I'm going with that, but let me know your thoughts. And I think I have an idea, but I want to save that for another video. So let me know your thoughts about that. Because this next part is when they actually start making the plan, okay? This is when they are eyeing out Billy at the pool, okay? And they basically say that the Mind Flayer likes it cold, and they notice that Billy is, like, wearing all of this stuff. But then Max jumps in again, and she's trying to defend Billy, and you can see this, all right? She does not want this host to be Billy, and you could tell this from her the whole time that she's really just trying to doubt that this could be Billy. Because then all of a sudden she says, oh, well, he's just lounging at the pool. That's, like, the least Mind Flayer-like thing to do. All right. But then our boy Will jumps in again with his knowledge of all of this, okay? And he goes, no, not necessarily. And do you not see all of our characters just give him this look like, how the frick do you know this, Will? Because then Will explains that the Mind Flayer likes to hide and that it only uses you when it actually needs you and it goes dormant, okay? But when it needs you, it activates. So how Will explains this, people, keep that in mind, that in my opinion, if we're seeing Will connect to two things necessarily, one part being the Mind Flayer, but not full on, okay? Just this activation part. Because logically, if he is connecting to Henry Creel in any way, shape, or form, and Henry Creel obviously is infected by the Mind Flayer as Vecna, maybe that's all Will is connecting to here, is that he's connecting and he knows that when the Mind Flayer is activated, but he's not actually connecting to the Mind Flayer itself. He only knows when the Mind Flayer is being activated, and that's that little tingle in the back of his neck, but he does not know anything else logically, or at least he does not feel anything that the Mind Flayer is feeling logically. So keep that in mind, because this is when we see a little bit of proof of that, in my opinion, because Mike says to the girls, you guys stay here, we're going to go make the plan basically for the sauna test. This is when Mike discovers this plan. They walk into the locker room, walk over to the sauna, and then what? They look at the sauna, okay, and then all of a sudden Will ask, and he goes, well, is it going to be hot enough? Like he's concerned or something, or like he knows that it needs to specifically be to a certain degree for this to actually work. But the main thing you got to realize is when they actually seen this happen and when this actually happened, people, Will was the one that was infected. So how would Will know the exact degree all of this would need to be, okay? Or why is he concerned that it wouldn't be hot enough, okay? How does he know this, right? And no, I do not mean that he is infected or he is connecting to the Mind Flayer because of this. I think he has knowledge of this, but you got to think he's obviously not concerned about himself or his own health if he is connected to the Mind Flayer right now, correct? So then all of a sudden it jumps, okay, and it jumps to this apology between Lucas and Will, and then this is when Will basically says, Lucas, stop, I do not care, there's bigger things to worry about, all right? And then he shows him the chains. And this is another example, in my opinion, that Will knows something. He knows something about the temperature, he knows something about the strength of what is going on, okay? But logically, okay, if he is infected by the Mind Flayer or connecting to the Mind Flayer like he was in season 2, he is not worried about what's happening right now, what they're about to go do, right? But then finally, we get to the sauna test itself, okay? And we see them lure Billy into the sauna, all right? And Billy's in there, okay? And then basically Will's the one that turns that shit up all the way to 220 degrees, like they said. But then as Billy is freaking out, okay, and he's trying to get out, he's saying, let me out, and he's spitting at the glass, all right? All of a sudden, we get another random little connection between Max and Will, people, and we get this little stare, okay, which I just find odd that during this whole scene, okay, we're getting some random stares and connections and questions asked between Max and Will, which we do not really see a lot of involvement between these two friends in this show. It's just very interesting to me that during this whole sauna test explanation is when we are seeing this for pretty much the only time, in my opinion. But then all of a sudden we get a connection to season 2 here with how Billy starts acting. He falls to the ground, and what does he start doing? He starts crying, and he's trying to lure Max in, right? He's trying to make her feel bad for him. He's crying like crazy, saying, it wasn't me, I didn't do it. And they're asking him, and he's like, it was like a shadow, okay? So he's basically showing them this. But like I said earlier, people, what happened to Billy is different than what happened to Will. So Billy at this point in time is a goner, okay? He is not there, right? Logically, what happened to Billy, he is fully infected. His entire body is infected, including his mind. Because right here, people, this is when we get our actual proof, okay? Because we see Billy and Max, they're talking, okay? She's trying to calm him down, saying it's going to be okay, and then what happens? We see Will get his little neck-tingling feeling of the Mind Flayer activating, correct? He feels it being activated. But then what happens, people? We see Billy get up, right? Like he's being activated, okay? And he smashes through that window, almost gets Max. They pull her back, and then who does what? Lucas does what he does best, and he shoots him in the eye. And when I mean by the eye, I mean his third eye, okay? And the only reason I say that line is because that's a line from season 1, what Lucas says he's going to do to the Demogorgon. He's going to shoot it in the eye and kill it, right? So what do we see Lucas do? He shoots him in his eye, his third eye, okay? But then this is the part you got to pay attention to, and this is the proof that I think I caught. Because all of a sudden, we just saw Will. He felt it activate, right? And then this happens. Billy gets basically knocked to the ground because of what Lucas just did. But then all of a sudden, Billy starts coming to, right? And he gets up and he puts his arms on like the little bench or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, we see this mind flayer really activate, okay? But we do not see Will feel this, right? We see Billy get veins through his entire freaking body, okay? Which we never really saw happen with Will. We only saw it in his neck when the mind flayer was about to come out of him. We did not see this go full on crazy like how this happens, because Will's mind was only infected back then, not his entire full body from what we see. But then all of a sudden Billy kind of does this little float thing that we see, and we see all of these veins, and this is when Will does not feel a thing. And this is what you got to keep in mind, because we get proof of this. We all of a sudden get this flash that Mrs. Driscoll at the hospital where Nancy is at is feeling exactly what Billy is feeling, okay, because of the heat. But who is not feeling this right now, people, and not screaming bloody murder like he was back in season 2? Our boy Will. So logically, in my opinion, people, this should prove that Will is connecting to something else at this point in time, and something else that might be in control of the mind flayer. And yes, from what we see, that would be Vecna. But in my opinion, people, I really truly think that he's not just connecting to Vecna. I think he's getting a little bit of both, because we see in season 4 that Henry Creel, who got put into the Dimension X or the Upside Down, wherever the hell he went, we see that he kind of gets shocked and kind of becomes deformed, but we don't see him turn into that yet. We never truly see how he transformed into this gross-looking monster. But we do see at the very end of season 4 when Vecna is talking to Eleven and telling his story, okay, that he came across something that would change everything, all right? We see this scene as Henry Creel finding the mind flayer, all right? But if we think about this logically, okay, even in that scene, people, there's two sides of that story while Vecna himself is talking, which we are going to talk about in the next theory. Because what we're going to do is we are going to analyze that conversation very, very thoroughly. And I'm going to show you proof. And I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can, that during that scene, we see sides of Henry Creel and we see sides of Vecna. And yes, I say those two people separately because those are two separate things. Henry Creel is a living person that got put somewhere and got infected by the mind flayer, right? And then our group explains this monster or whatever it is that this is Vecna, because that's the reference from Dungeons and Dragons. This is not actually what this is. So logically, people, Henry Creel is inside of that monster that we see, all right? So if we can possibly see in season 5, like I really, really, truly think we are going to, based off those behind the scenes footage, I really truly think that we might end up seeing a battle between Henry Creel and Will fighting over this mind flayer monster for some reason. And I don't want to say that Will wants it back, but I think this could be the only way to truly, truly stop Vecna in a way. The only way is that if somebody truly takes in the mind flayer other than Henry Creel, if you ask me. But let me know your thoughts about all of this. I know this was kind of a long and confusing one, but let me know your thoughts. Because in my opinion, people, throughout all of these scenes, we're seeing the proof right here, even based off the flashbacks that they showed us, that before Will was infiltrated and then while Will gets infiltrated. Because our boy Will straight up says that before he was actually infiltrated, people, he was feeling something, but it just makes no logical sense how he was feeling the mind flayer before he was actually infiltrated by the mind flayer, because from what we see in season 1, that shit never happened, right? The only possible thing that we actually see Will could be connecting to at all from season 1 and in season 2, okay, before he's infiltrated is what, people? And if you are a fan of this show, you should know that the only thing we see Will connect is Dart, okay? But what does this mean? So logically, I'm just going to ask you this last question because we see proof of kind of him connecting to Henry Creel, and we see proof of him connecting to the Mind Flayer from him feeling the activation only, okay? And he does not feel this in his body or feel pain when all of these other people infected at this point in time are feeling this pain, okay? But based off proof and based off of what we've seen in the show, the only thing that Will has a connection to before that Mind Flayer is whatever Dart ends up being, okay? Which ends up, in my opinion, being a Demogorgon or grows into a Demogorgon. So that now kind of gives our monster from season 1 a little bit more importance than we ever really thought, in my opinion. But like I said, this was a long and confusing one, so let me know your thoughts, people. I hope you guys like this one. This was a big one. This was a big topic to go over, and trust me, there is a lot that I still need to think about here because, trust me, all of these scenes, there are so much to analyze, but what I want to give you guys a little hint of how I do this is watch what they say, okay? Just really pay attention to the words. And then if you decide to really pay attention and rewatch it, after you pay attention to those words, look for symbols, okay? Because that's how you find these connections. I've watched this scene 1,000 freaking times, people, but not once did I ever really think about it like this. So with all that being said, let me know your thoughts. I love each and every single one of you. Keep growing this family. We're almost at 1.1 already. You guys are amazing. And as always, you guys already know, we out.